Here's a brief summary of some of the latest developments this week in Gaza. Our senior editor, Maureen Claire Murphy, reported that a phased deal had been reached between Israel and Hamas to end the brutal and devastating war, which should go into effect on Sunday. Maureen writes, quote, "The text of the agreement, mediated in part by Qatar, has not been published officially. The Prime Minister of the Gulf state said that the exact terms of the second and third phase have yet to be hammered out by the two parties. Prime Minister 𝐓𝐡𝐞 said that the first phase of the deal would take place over 42 days and see the release of 33 Israelis held captive in Gaza, both living and dead, and both soldiers and civilians, in exchange for an unspecified number of Palestinians being held in Israeli prisons and detention centers. That phase also includes the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza's populated areas, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 added, as well as evacuation of the wounded for medical treatment outside of Gaza. Palestinians displaced within Gaza will be able to return will be able to return to their homes during the first phase, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 said, and there will be a surge in desperately needed humanitarian aid across the territory. The Qatari Prime Minister said that Doha would work closely with Cairo and Washington to guarantee the implementation of the agreement, but that it was up to the parties to fully commit to all three phases, honor their obligations, and reach a lasting ceasefire. For more of Maureen Claire Murphy's report and analysis, read Qatar announces ceasefire deal on electronicintifada.net. And we'll discuss the latest on the deal later on in the program. In the lead up to the ceasefire announcement on Wednesday, and in the hours following, Israel carried out massacres and campaigns of further destruction across the Gaza Strip. Al Jazeera's Hani Mahmoud reported on Wednesday that, quote, "The more we hear about a potential ceasefire agreement, the higher the pace of the attacks, the more families are being targeted and killed. At least 59 Palestinians were killed in a series of attacks just hours before the deal was reached. And Gaza's civil defense stated that the Israeli military intensified its bombardment of Gaza City right after the ceasefire announcement. In the early hours of Thursday, this morning, journalist Anas al-Sharif reported that 30 Palestinians, including children, were killed in Gaza City a few hours after the ceasefire was announced. Quote, "The Israeli occupation army extinguished this joy," he said. "Israel doesn't want the children, women, and families who have endured this war during the past period to live in peace, safety, and happiness." And the attacks have continued. The Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza said earlier this morning that since the ceasefire deal was announced, 72 people have been killed. Early Wednesday morning, Israel bombed a home in Deir al-Balah in the central Gaza Strip, killing 12 people, including a 7-year-old boy and 3 teenagers, according to the Palestinian Civil Defense Corps. Israel also bombed a school shelter in Gaza City and a home in the Burej refugee camp. On Monday, January 13th, a series of Israeli drone strikes killed at least 33 Palestinians across Gaza, including 7 separate attacks on Palestinians in Gaza City. On Tuesday, Israel bombed a shop along the coastal road in Deir al-Balah, which sparked a large fire that, driven by strong sea winds, quickly spread to engulf makeshift displacement encampments, according to the UN. While no casualties were reported, 67 families lost all their belongings as their tents were destroyed in the fire. The Israeli army ordered the further forced displacement of people in Jabalia in northern Gaza on Wednesday. The Gaza government media office stated on January 12th that 100 days have passed since Israel began its targeted campaign of destruction and slaughter in the north, leaving approximately 5,000 Palestinians dead or missing, 9,500 wounded, and 2,600 abducted. Quote, "During these 100 days, our Palestinian people in the northern Gaza Strip have experienced the most heinous forms of killing, ethnic cleansing, destruction, and displacement," the media office declared. Quote, "The destruction of homes, hospitals, public facilities, and infrastructure clearly exposes the intention of the Israeli occupation to deliberately and systematically eliminate the foundations of life in the Gaza Strip, causing a deep humanitarian crisis that exacerbates the suffering of our honorable Palestinian people. We affirm that our Palestinian people will remain steadfast in the face of this brutal aggression and that the occupation will not succeed in displacing our people and depriving them of their rights. These crimes will only increase our Palestinian people's determination to obtain their legitimate rights and regain their seized land. The aid group Relief International reported on January 10th that Al-Auda Hospital in Jalia, the last barely functioning hospital in the north, came under direct attack by Israeli occupation forces. The hospital received immediate evacuation orders at the beginning of January, and Relief International said that since then, the hospital has been awaiting clearance for the safe evacuation of patients to Gaza City. However, it had not been granted. An Al Jazeera correspondent said on Wednesday that Israeli vehicles were beginning to bulldoze the western side of the Indonesian hospital, which was completely rendered out of service last month. The UN reports that its health partners, quote, are warning of severe fuel shortages that are putting essential services at risk. According to the partners, all hospitals that are still partially functioning have exhausted their fuel reserves. They are now relying on piecemeal deliveries of fuel each day to try and sustain the most critical services. We continue our reporting on Israel's abduction and subsequent disappearing of Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, the director of the Kamal Adwan Hospital in Beit Lahia in the north of Gaza. The hospital was surrounded and destroyed by Israeli forces on December 27th after more than 80 days of relentless attacks because doctors refused to abandon their patients and staff. Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights announced on Wednesday that they had confirmed that Israel had transferred Abu Safiya to Ofer military prison on January 9th. Israeli authorities continue to bar Abu Safiya from meeting Al-Mizan's lawyer until January 22nd. The American Academy of Pediatrics, representing tens of thousands of pediatricians and pediatric specialists, demanded that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken work to immediately release Dr. Abu Safiya, who is also a pediatrician as well as the director of Kamal Adwan Hospital. The American Academy of Pediatrics had been under pressure by groups such as Doctors Against Genocide, who had demanded the institution take a stand to end the genocide in Gaza and free their fellow pediatrician and so many other Palestinian doctors from illegal Israeli detention. Israel killed at least 6 journalists in Gaza this past week, bringing the number of reporters and media workers killed since October 2023 to 208. On January 10th, Saeed Sabri Nabhan, who worked as a photojournalist with the Al-Gad satellite channel, was killed by an Israeli sniper in Nuseirat refugee camp, according to the Gaza government media office. On January 13th, Mohammed Bashir al-Talmas, an editor at the Palestinian press agency Safa, died after sustaining injuries during an Israeli airstrike on the Sheikh Radwan neighborhood in Gaza City. Also on January 13th, Israel killed Ahlam al-Nafad, a journalist and photographer, while she was walking to Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, according to Dropsite News. Al-Nafad, who is also a nurse, documented the relentless attacks on the Indonesian hospital. 2 reporters, Aqil Salah and Ahmed Abu al-Rus, were killed on Wednesday in separate airstrikes. Salah was killed in an air attack that targeted a group of people in the Shati refugee camp west of Gaza City, Al Jazeera reported. And Abu al-Rus was killed in Nuseirat along with 3 others in an Israeli airstrike that targeted the vehicle they were in. Abu al-Rus had uploaded a video of himself just hours before he was killed, expressing joy and cautious optimism at the prospect of a ceasefire. He said, quote, "All good people, we are now in the final moments. We, the people of Gaza, need your prayers," in his video. Also on Wednesday, journalist Ahmed al-Shaya was killed in an Israeli airstrike targeting a food distribution point in al-Mawasi, west of Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip. We've published many features on the Electronic Intifada in the last week, but we wanted to highlight excerpts of this one by Malak Hijazi, our contributor based in Gaza. Malak writes, quote, "For 15 long months, the people of Gaza have endured a brutal genocidal war. We've lost loved ones, homes, and any sense of normalcy. But as talks of a potential ceasefire grow, hope flickers that it might take effect before U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's inauguration next week. Our eyes remain glued to our phones, scrolling through news, both real and fake, waiting for the announcement. We long to hear the word ceasefire spoken aloud, a fragile sense of relief after all the death we have witnessed. Reports of progress in negotiations spark fleeting celebrations, with cheers rising from makeshift tents, schoolyards, and partially destroyed houses, where 1.9 million people, 90% of Gaza's population, have been forced to find shelter. Yet, as we reflect more deeply on the situation, our faint happiness fades into disillusionment. While a ceasefire may silence the bombs, it raises a far heavier question. What comes next? For those of us who remain barely alive, the future feels like a question mark. I live in constant fear, haunted by the uncertainty of whether Gaza will ever heal. And honestly, I don't ask for much. I long for Gaza as it was before the genocide, with all its daily flaws and struggles. But even that feels like too much to ask. How do you rebuild a home when the very force accused of destroying it holds the keys to its recovery? Will Israel ever allow us to rebuild what it has destroyed, or let us claim our liberty? I can't stop thinking about a report the United Nations released back in 2012 titled Gaza in 2020, A Livable Place. It outlined a bleak future for Gaza, forecasting immense challenges as the population grew from 1.6 million to an anticipated 2.1 million by 2020. The report warned of critical issues. Electricity supply would need to double. The coastal aquifer, our primary source of fresh water, was at risk of irreversible collapse, and tens of thousands of housing units were urgently required. Looking back on that report now, it feels hauntingly prescient. Yet even its stark warnings could not have imagined the horrors we now face. The report was written long before the 2023 genocidal war that has devastated Gaza beyond recognition. It assumed a Gaza that, while strained, would still exist, still function. It did not anticipate a reality where survival itself would be in question. Malak ends her piece with this call. This war will not end with the last airstrike. Its effects will linger in the rubble, in the struggle to rebuild, and in the constant fear that the ceasefire will not last. The people of Gaza need more than words of solidarity. We need meaningful global action to support reconstruction and ensure accountability. Those are excerpts from This Will Not End with the Last Airstrike by Malak Hijazi on electronicintifada.net. And finally, as we always do, we wanted to share images of people expressing defiance and resilience in the face of Israel's campaign of destruction. In the past 24 hours, as the news of the possible ceasefire spread, Palestinians poured into the streets in celebration across Gaza. Two of the journalists we rely on for news in the north, Anas al-Sharif and Hossam Shabat, were in the streets reporting live as the ceasefire deal was announced on Wednesday evening. Anas al-Sharif said, quote, "I can take this helmet off, which has exhausted me throughout this entire period, and this flak jacket as well, which has been part of my body during this period. And now we announce from here, within the Gaza Strip and from within Gaza City, the announcement of a ceasefire for these citizens and for all residents of Gaza."
هذه الخوذة ميادة التي أرهقتني طوال هذه الفترة، وأيضا هذا الدرع الذي كان جزء من جسدي خلال هذه المدة وخلال هذه الفترة الطويلة، والذي كان على مدار الوقت يرافقني. والآن نعلن هنا من داخل قطاع غزة ومن داخل مدينة غزة هذا الإعلان ووقف إطلاق النار للمواطنين ولكل سكان غزة الذين
While being carried on the shoulders of his community, Hossam Shabat said that it was a joyful atmosphere and that his eyes welled up with tears. Shabbat wrote early this morning on Twitter or X that, quote, "I can hardly believe it. After 16 long months, I'm on the verge of reuniting with my family. The news of the ceasefire brings such a wave of relief that we desperately need. I've made a promise to myself to continue reporting as long as the genocide continues. But soon I can finally rest, and most importantly, I'll soon be able to hug my mom." In central Gaza, a woman spoke to journalist Fadi Tabet, explaining that the people will rebuild Gaza. She says, quote, "We will remove the rubble, we will rebuild, and Gaza will return to being even more beautiful. This little girl, the daughter of a martyr, her sister, this person, that person, there's an old man, a young man, all of us will rebuild it, and it will go back to being better than before. Gaza is inside of us. We are the ones who remained steadfast and endured. None of them achieved anything, not one leader or any country. The real achievement is here. Those who achieved, this is me, her, and them, and we are proud that we achieved this and we endured. May God grant you health."
وحنبني وحنعمر وحترجع غزة أحلى من قبل. في طفلة بنت شهيد، في أختها، في ختيار، في شاب، كلنا حنعمرها وحترجع أحلى من قبل. غزة فينا، إحنا اللي صمدنا وإحنا اللي صبرنا، ولا إنجازات لأي حدا ولا لأي قيادة ولا لأي كبير ولا أي دولة. الإنجاز هنا، هذا الإنجاز وأنا وهي وفيها، ونفتخر إنه إحنا اللي أنجزنا، إنه صبرنا. يعطيك العافية.
And finally, a group of children erupted with joy at hearing the news of a looming ceasefire. And that's it for the news roundup. As always, go to electronicintifada.net for much more, especially to read our new features by our brave writers in Gaza.